Okay, let's speak now to Nile Gardiner, who's a foreign policy analyst and is also the director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for joining us, Nile. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. Last week we had the legal migration figures, eye-watering numbers, 745,000 through the front door, fully legal, fully stamped, fully approved by this government, and absolutely obliterating the 2019 manifesto pledge of the Conservative Party, which was to reduce overall numbers below 239,000. A lot of people, Niall, are going to be starting to think now, this government hasn't got a Scooby-Doo what it's doing, and whatever it says, it can't control the borders, and they've utterly failed on their manifesto pledge.
Martin, thanks very much for having me on the show today. And the figures you're describing there are absolutely disgraceful. They're unacceptable, and a Conservative government should be reducing net migration rather than increasing it. And this has to be a top priority, of course, for the Conservatives. I have to say, I think the removal of Suella Braverman as Home Secretary was an absolutely disastrous move. Suella was determined to, I think, reverse this kind of open borders approach that we've seen. But she was thrown out of office. That was a terrible move by the government. We need to see the Conservative government taking some real action here, starting, of course, with the withdrawal from the European Convention on Human Rights, because nothing can be done, I think, in terms of stopping illegal migration until the UK actually withdraws from that treaty. And also, we have to see a determined effort to reduce the flow of legal migration into the UK. The proposals that Suella Braverman had were actually very good proposals. They should be implemented immediately. And Rishi Sunak, I think, on the immigration front, there's been too much mixed messaging, confusion within the Conservative government. That has to change. And I think his leadership on the immigration issue has been very poor so far.
And it's fair to say Rishi today was extolling the virtues of foreign students who can come to Britain and stay for 2 years after their courses expire. Yet the fact of the matter is, Niall, last week we found out 378,000 of those student visas were issued, a 58,000 increase, plus 96,000 dependents, relatives, wives, children, and so on and so forth. And 65% of those people remain in the UK once their course expires. That's a city the size of Liverpool. They're coming in through the front door and are being stamped through by this government. I put it to you, Niall, that small boats and stopping illegal immigration, of course, is a pertinent point, but the front door is wide open.
Yeah, I think, the government has addressed the issue of both illegal migration into the UK, the small boats crisis, and the issue of rising legal migration. And I do think it's scandalous that you have hundreds of thousands of dependents of students studying in the UK coming into British cities. This has to end. I mean, this is, I think, a completely the wrong direction for the government to be taking. And with regard to the small boats crisis, put the Royal Navy in place to stop the boats coming. Send a clear message to the French. It's unacceptable to be sending over large numbers of migrants from French shores over to the UK. Have the Royal Navy put a stop to this, take some real action. My former boss, Margaret Thatcher, would have put an end to this immediately. There seems to be a lack of spine, a lack of backbone, frankly, in the British government right now, including the Prime Minister's own office. This has to change. A Conservative government should control the flow of legal and illegal migration coming into the UK. This is what a Conservative government has pledged to do. It needs to stand by those pledges to the British people. And we have seen, I think, far too much weakness and a sheer lack of resolve from the Prime Minister and from the government at this time.
And Niall, briefly, if we could, do you think the Tories can turn this around now, or is this just mission terminated? And also on that point, if things are looking bleak under the Conservatives, what do you think a future would look like under a Keir Starmer government?
Well, I have to say the outlook for the Conservative government looks extremely grim, according to all of the polls. That's what happens if you don't actually implement Conservative policies as a Conservative government. Your own voters desert you. As for Labour, of course, they'll be 10 times worse. The Labour Party would implement catastrophically bad immigration policies, I'd expect the level of illegal migration and legal migration would double at least under the Labour Party. There would be an absolute disaster. Also, of course, they would start to try and dismantle Brexit as well. Labour would be a real threat to Britain. The Conservatives have got to get their act together, and if necessary, they need to put a new leader of the Conservative Party in place who can actually win an election.
OK, Nile Gardiner, great to talk to you. As ever, Director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. Join us there live from Washington, D.C. Thank you very much. Now, former Labour Minister for Europe, Dennis McShane, joined me earlier, and he had this to say about Sunak and Braverman's plans.
My flabber was gasped when I read Suella Braverman is now calling for £40,000 minimum wage for immigrants. My God. I mean, I fought for the minimum wage for 20 years against the Tories when it came in. £40,000? I mean, imagine all the pensioners of Britain saying, oh, I'm going to come and become an immigrant. Suella will pay me 40 grand a year. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous for huge swathes of employers. Let's just Martin and Dennis in a start-up cafe. We can't afford to pay £40,000 to somebody who cleans it. And all the time in it, I say we're not training our own people. I mean, I'm representing a working class area. Mrs. Thatcher abolished apprenticeships that work quite well. They still work well in Germany, the Netherlands, in France and Switzerland, so they can train up more French, Swiss, Germans to do jobs. They're slightly less reliant on incoming labour, but we just have abolished all that. So you mentioned, I think, a welder. You want a good welder, then you're not going to find many Brits, where you'll find a lot of Poles or Czechs, but we banished all of those because what Rishi has done is import up to 962,000 men and women from Nigeria, Pakistan, India, Philippines, when they're waiting to be trained in Portsmouth, in Rotherham, in Blackpool.